This presentation is brought to you by nonprofitaccountingbasics.org, an educational project of the Greater Washington Society of CPAs Educational Foundation.
My name is Sheila Amo, and I'm here today to speak about FLSA. Let's start with a brief history about FLSA to ensure we're on the same page. FLSA is an acronym that stands for the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act is a federal statute that was passed by Congress in 1938 as part of the New Deal legislation. At the time, President Roosevelt called it the most important piece of the New Deal legislation since the Social Security Act of 1935. FLSA comes under the authority of the Department of Labor, and it's a law that applies to private sector employers as well as local, state, and federal government employers. Prior to the passage of the Act, employment conditions in the U.S. were at best unregulated and inconsistent. In many instances, work conditions disproportionately advantaged employers while they adversely impacted workers. In some cases, workers were subject to harmful or unsafe conditions. Consequently, the FLSA addressed several areas. It introduced the 40-hour work week, established a national minimum wage. It guaranteed pay at time and a half for overtime in certain jobs. It prohibited oppressive child labor, prevented children under 18 from engaging in certain dangerous jobs, prevented children under 16 from working during school hours, and finally, it set a standard for recording time and maintaining those records. The Act classifies workers into two categories: non-exempt and exempt. This means an employee is either exempt from the overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act, or an employee is not exempt. Non-exempt employees must be paid the minimum wage. They must be paid an overtime rate for any hours worked over 40 hours per week. Exempt employees are not entitled to overtime pay. They are paid for the job they do, not the hours they keep. The key distinction is that non-exempt workers must be paid for every hour they work. It's illegal not to do so. Additionally, it's not permissible to offer non-exempts compensatory time or administrative leave in lieu of pay for hours worked. By doing so, an organization is running afoul of the law and therefore increases susceptibility to wage and hour claims. It's up to employers to determine whether an employee is exempt or non-exempt from the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. This determination would likely be made prior to filling a position by reviewing the job's scope and responsibilities. Another consideration to be factored into the determination is the supervisory responsibilities. In a few slides, we'll talk briefly about how to make the determination and go through some basic self-audit tests for classifying workers under FLSA. In addition to properly classifying new hires, it's important for employers to regularly review the job descriptions of current employees to ensure proper classifications as job responsibilities evolve and change over time. An employer is most likely to get into trouble by erroneously classifying a worker as exempt when the duties of the job don't support that classification. If you consider it, an employer can save money by classifying an employee as exempt because the obligation to pay overtime goes away. Generally, two requirements must be met to classify an employee as exempt. They must earn a specified salary, and they must hold a position with duties the U.S. Department of Labor designates as appropriate for exempt positions. There are three broad categories of exempt employees, which are typically referred to as EAP, or executive, administrative, and professional. For the purpose of this presentation and for ease of use, I've flushed out the professional category to include learned professionals, computer professionals, creative professionals, and outside sales professionals. Before we cover these categories, let's first discuss the basic exemption tests, which are to be used in combination with each other. The first indicator an employer should use to determine whether a position is exempt or non-exempt is the salary level test. According to the Act, employees making less than $23,600 are almost always classified as non-exempt. Employees earning more than $100,000 are considered highly compensated and therefore almost always classified as exempt. The second indicator is whether the worker's annual salary is paid as a guaranteed minimum every pay period, irrespective of the number of hours worked during that period. This is customary for exempt workers. Conversely, non-exempt workers are paid for the hours they work, which means their pay is subject to increase or decrease from one pay period to the next, depending on their schedule. The final indicator deals with job duties and scope. Some questions to be answered for this indicator are as follows. Is the worker a key decision maker? How do their decisions impact the organization? Do they drive profit or impact the overall business of the organization? Does the employee work independently and exercise discretion in matters that affect business operations? Or do they require daily guidance, supervision, and oversight? Again, these questions get to whether or not the position is high level, what are the tasks of the job, and how do those job tasks fit into the employer's overall operations. It should also be noted that titles don't matter. You can call a receptionist a manager or CEO, but if her duties include answering phones and greeting people as they arrive, she's a non-exempt worker, irrespective of that title. In the next few slides, we'll cover the specific exemption tests. The E in the EAP stands for executive. When determining whether an employee should be classified as an exempt executive, some of the questions to be asked are, is the employee's primary duty managing the enterprise or a department or subdivision of the enterprise? Does the employee customarily direct the work of two or more other employees or their equivalent? Does the employee make hiring and firing decisions? If not, does their recommendation carry significant weight in these matters? Is the employee paid the equivalent of at least $455 per week on a salary basis? In general, answering no to any of these questions means the worker is not an exempt executive. The A stands for administrative. When determining whether someone should be classified as an exempt administrative employee, some of the questions to be asked are, is the employee's primary duty performing office or non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations of the employer or the employer's customers? Does the employee exercise discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance? Is the employee paid the equivalent of at least $455 per week on a salary basis? In general, answering no to any of these means the worker is not an exempt administrative employee. When determining whether an employee should be classified as a learned professional, some of the questions to be asked are, is the employee's primary duty to perform work requiring knowledge of an advanced type, in a field of science or learning customarily acquired by a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction? Is the advanced knowledge obtained by completing an academic course of study, resulting in a 4-year college degree or leading to a certification? Is the employee paid the equivalent of at least $455 per week on a salary basis? Some examples of learned professionals are lawyers, doctors, and CPAs. In general, answering no to any of these questions means the worker is not an exempt learned professional. When determining whether an employee should be classified as a creative professional, some questions to be asked are, is the employee's primary duty to perform work requiring invention, originality, or talent in a recognized field of artistic endeavor such as music, writing, acting, and the graphic arts? Does the work require more than intelligence, diligence, and accuracy? For example, does it require talent? Is the employee paid the equivalent of at least $455 per week on a salary basis? Some examples of creative professionals are writers, editors, graphic designers, and actors. In general, answering no to any of these questions means the worker is not an exempt creative professional. When determining whether an employee should be classified as a computer professional, the questions to be asked are related to the specific duties and pay as listed in the slide. Computer professionals include programmers, network engineers, testers, etc. They deal with hardware and software. If you answered no to any of the questions in the slide, the employee should not be classified as an exempt level computer professional. Last but not least, when determining whether an employee should be exempt under the outside salesperson exemption, some of the questions to be asked are as follows. Is the employee's primary duty making outside sales? Does the employee regularly work away from the company's place of business? Does the worker sell tangible or intangible items such as goods, insurance, stocks, bonds, or real estate, or obtain orders or contracts for services or the use of facilities? If you answered no to any of these, that means the worker is not an exempt outside sales employee. Some jobs, such as agricultural workers and movie theater workers, are specifically excluded from the Act. Another type of exclusion is for jobs governed by some other federal labor law, like railroad workers, who are governed by the Railway Labor Act, and truck drivers, who are governed by the Motor Carriers Act. In response to a March 2014 executive order signed by President Obama, which proposed sweeping changes to the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Department of Labor has published a notice of proposed rulemaking. The proposed changes include more than doubling the minimum salary necessary for a worker to be classified as exempt from the FLSA's overtime regulations. This would be an increase from $23,600 to $50,440 annually, essentially mandating that an employee's job responsibilities must satisfy the duties test, and they would need to earn more than the new minimum of $50,440 to be considered exempt. It's estimated that over 5 million currently exempt salaried employees will be affected by the increased salary threshold should this proposed change be approved. The changes would also increase the annual salary threshold from $100,000 to $122,000 for exemption as a highly compensated employee. Another significant change would be the automatic updating of the standard salary levels based on the Consumer Price Index or a fixed percentile of wage earnings for full-time salaried workers. The CPI method would be adjusted based on changes in inflation, whereas the fixed percentile method would be adjusted annually to the 40th percentile for full-time salaried workers, based on information published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Other changes touch on whether to include non-discretionary bonuses in calculating the salary threshold for EAP workers, which would beg the question as to whether changes to the EAP duties test are also warranted. The DOL will consider comments made during the public comment period prior to drafting the final rule. This could take anywhere from a few months to several years. There's certainly more to come on the changes to FLSA. For additional information about the Fair Labor Standards Act, please visit the Department of Labor's website at www.dol.gov. Another great resource is the Society for Human Resource Management. You can visit their website at www.shrm.org. Thank you, and this concludes my presentation for the day.